The next morning found the tailor's daughter examining the gooseberry bushes out back of her family's cottage, regretting the end of their fruit, which had been jammed a month before, and the caterpillars, who had quit the plot several months before that, she having encouraged them to do so. It also found, as did the girl, Mr. Winter in a fine stretch of leg, hastily travelling southward down his backyard field, with a footman running after him, calling out the necessity of a waistcoat and jacket, these flapping about in the poor man's hands. She watched as the servant caught up to him and helped him into his fine dark blue coat over a simple white riding cravat and a grey lilac waistcoat. Then, refusing his top hat, he peered further down the field at his original intention, King Street, and then the opposite direction, finally gesturing to the wheezing fellow that they should retrace their paths back toward his home. The servant, still looking rather ill after having achieved the farmhouse, gave him a nod and disappeared through the kitchen entry, yet he continued northward until from the vantage of the tailor's garden he too was gone. Mr. Winter, with equal fervour to that just witnessed, paced alongside the row of trees that bordered the eastern edge of his property until they were no more, and then further along a path that connected his neighbour's farmhouse to the paths that divided up its northwestern fields. He waved to a group of labourers sowing winter wheat into a recently tilled field, to which some nodded and waved back, some stared a little, unimpressed, having seen him before on the self-same path that summer, whilst a few were wholly undistracted by the sight of the gentleman striding toward the southern edge of the Hedgely Wood, several hundred yards before them. Hedgely Wood marked the border of all the northernmost agrarian fields of the town. It was an extensive forest that ran 2 miles from the eastern edge of these, westward to Westfield Road, which briefly separated such from its western counterpart, Woodbridge Wood, the latter continuing on another mile. These woods were more wide than long and kept a variable shape that a man could blaze directly northward and have but a couple thousand feet to negotiate in some portions, and yet would be obliged to commit to more than a mile in others. Several other smaller woods, groves and hamlets of only a few dozen cottages also gathered around the area, the entire affair causing a great natural interruption between the towns of Woodbridge and Hedgely. Mr. Winter plunged into the forest and continued northward on a path that showed some regular use, perhaps in the innocent collection of fallen wood by Hedgley's northern occupants. He took in, deeply, the cool air flavoured by the scent of the first batches of freshly fallen leaves littering the path, and noted the songs of the tree pipit and sparrow which confounded those of the grey partridge, lapwing and corn bunting he had just left behind in the hedges and fields. These birds he had identified as a novice naturalist, a trait born that summer when he had come to town to examine the renovations to his new home and adventure in the countryside. He had also done quite well concerning the trees. This particular wood kept a vast population of ash, but other common species noted thus far were local varieties of beech, oak, maple, sweet chestnut, horse chestnut, willow, and birch, though his portfolio was far from complete. In one particular park west of Woodbridge Woods, he had also seen common yew, sycamore, and a few lonely Norway spruce that were more than likely transplants brought by one of the park's ancient owners. After several hundred feet, his path ran perpendicularly into another, and he continued on the western leg of such, running alongside a credible brook whose turbulent waters added to the soundscape of calls, buzzes, knocks, clicks, chirps, and the scattering of leaves by unseen creatures making their way to safety upon his determined approach. And as he momentarily halted his march to examine a particular stream pool for trout, he contemplated the extensive variance between olden woodland and the modern farmland which now dominated the countryside at the expense of the former. His thoughts ran upon ancient times well before Christ, when it was found that a monoculture crop planted continuously from one growing season to the next would exhaust the soil of its liveliness and promote the chronic lingering of disease, that farmers eventually adopted yearly or seasonal pauses which diminished these phenomena, during which their crops were grown on alternate sections of land. By the time of Charlemagne, such had transformed into a 3-field rotation, where one section of land was designated for wheat or rye during the autumn planting, whilst another was spring-planted with legumes, peas, lentils, beans, or the like, and a third section was left fallow. Variants upon this and manuring followed as man strived further to impress upon the land that it should produce even greater yields, that he, his brethren, and his animals may be better nourished. But the forest needed no such attention. The thirsty willow arranged itself by watercourses. The autumn leaves and the offerings of the birds, squirrels, and every other creature present manured the soil and enlivened it, that there were no areas fallow or need be so. Pestilence was held in check, Mr. Winter rationalised, as function of the rich variation of flora and fauna of the wood, for just as agrarian fields were less susceptible to disease as their contents became more varied season by season through the introduction of rotation, such manifested exponentially here, though he admitted that the mechanics of this were still partly a mystery, and acts of man, be they structures, paths, or otherwise, if left in want of attention, would be reclaimed by the forest, similar to the body's reaction to a minor cut or wound. It was as if the wood was a great perpetual clock, having hundreds to thousands of working parts, which were self-righting and self-tinkering, that all gave and received from each other purpose. He continued along his path until he met with a crossing which certainly was not in want of attention, for it owned a well-maintained width, accommodative to a pair of horses. He decided against it. He knew it to travel north-northeast to Woodbridge's eastern fields, whilst his intended destination lied north-northwest from his position. It did, however, signal that he was but 1,000 paces from Westfield Road, which indeed was of interest concerning his destination. He regretted this length, or lack thereof, as the act of traversing the woodland only increased his desire to do so. But presently he was obliged to an important engagement, and he dared not look aflat during his first official week as a new member of the towns. In fact, this call significantly involved one of his primary motivations for relocating into the agrarian countryside. He had spent years in the bosom of England's industrial might, taking that which men such as Court, Watt, Harrison, Bramah, Maudslay, Roberts, and countless others had conceived over the last half-century, and applying to such the marginal technological advancements, which are little romanticised when one considers the grander points of interest in the era, but which cumulatively supported it to a not insignificant degree. This entailed travelling back and forth from Lancashire and Manchester, to the Scottish lowlands, to Wales, and to anywhere else that his father, a successful inventor, financier, patent holder, factory owner, and vicious entrepreneur, a man Adam Smith would have called a master of mankind, did venture to try his luck, be it in iron, glass, cloth, or otherwise. And though Mr. Winter had never been in want of a living, he too felt the self-same lust for accomplishment that was his father's sustenance, and had set up shop alongside him inside several of those factories where he had designed and experimented at his pleasure. These woods and the quiet countryside nebulous to them, improbably little affected by the progress of industry, were therefore a heartily welcome change for Mr. Winter after years of soot, smoke, grease, and clatter. He intended to immerse himself into this small pocket of perpetuated history, luxuriate in the unadulterated air and land, and think little of his former duties, but instead fill his cup with designs of a more organic quality. Certainly it would do to examine at greater resolution some peculiarities of this clockwork that kept the forests in motion. Further, and more to his fancy, it would also do to study the town's fields with the greatest hope that they, or at least a given few at first, through applied natural philosophy could be impressed upon to yield a bit more than their current offering. He had no expectations of radical changes, nor did he care for such, having recently borne witness to the extensive progression of enclosure, Luddism, and the year without a summer, and thusly was convinced, for the sake of all things upon the earth that do draw breath, and as well his new home, that marginal progression, his specialty, should be held in the highest regard. He stepped onto Westfield Road and began toward Woodbridge, grabbing at a hat that was not atop his head, that he may tip it friendly at a set of young ladies and one's brother who'd been startled by his hasty emergence from the wood. They stared at him as he trotted away, less out of terror and more out of interest, for he was handsome enough in his finery to be contemplated, and a new gentleman in a small set of rural folk was always an excuse for inquiry, impolite though it sometimes was. A good way he trotted too before he came to a decorative T intersection whose primary route jaunted rightward in relation to Westfield Road, devoutly followed by a simple yarded fence, drowned in ivy. A wooden sign there, too partially succumbing to the decorative vine, announced that this was Compton Lane. Beyond the fence lied a yard of a few tall grass species that kept a cottage, unremarkable, but that it did, in its extensive northeastern vantage, keep watch over a moderately sized wooden bridge, which allowed Mr. Winter the luxury of crossing the River Compton without betraying his trousers or boots. This he did, and continued up the lane which paralleled the river a good 2,000 paces, though the hedges along the road, often so tall, thick and disheartened toward their tops that they fell into each other creating arched passages, kept the sound of the water decoupled from its sight. Eventually, pushing through one last burst of woodland on the lane, Mr. Winter emerged into the heart of Woodbridge and shortly came to Miller's Road, which held most of the town's shops on its eastern leg, and Woodbridge Inn in the opposite direction. He chose the latter way, desiring to briefly stop by the inn for a pint of the cloudy old scrumpy it was known for, having a cider mill and orchard out back of its property. "Dressed rather smart, I see, sir," the keep offered, having served him on a few occasions during the summer in which he had presented as a man of sweaty shirt-sleeves upon the conclusion of his rigorous explorations of Woodbridge Wood and its westerly groves. "Yes, well, today is business, for which I shan't be late. It goes down so handsomely, but may we settle presently, I beg?" he asked as he fiddled with his pocket-watch. For all his hasty downing of cider and agitated marching, late he probably would not be, he assured himself, now frequently, as he continued his invigorating walk up Miller's Road. He passed Church Street, the corner of which holding the Anglican parish of Jonathan Moore, whose grounds were elevated from the road and seemingly held in such fashion by a cobblestone wall of greyish-golden constituents occupying the perimeter. Immediately beyond this wall was a single line of soldierly trees, whose canopies were dense enough that they denied him a view of the church's tower, and he was obliged to be satisfied with but glimpses of its nave through the shadowed headstones inundating the base of the tree-line. Finally, he felt he was close to his destination by the starting of another wall on the opposite side of the road, which was of similar build to the church's, but so pompous in its vertical dimension that no sight may be envied nor regretted by the humble traveller, save that of a few tall oaks closely peeking over. And 10 minutes removed from when he had originally crossed Church Street, vexed at his waking hour that morning, his anxious grip on his watch relaxed, for this wall shortly ran its course, and he arrived at the whitewashed brick gatehouse guarding the driveway to Woodbridge Manor, the lavish and expansive country home of the squire George Moore, his wife and daughter, and their 14 servants.